Good afternoon, guys. How's it going? Before we get started, I just want to do two little housekeeping things. I'm going to put all the slides up on my site afterward, so you don't have to try to take a picture of everyone, because I'm going to go pretty quick, like I usually do. So instead, take pictures of me, because I'm not going to be up there all the time. And two, you have to be careful, because I don't know if you noticed, but I'm perfectly camouflaged to blend in with the conference, so you might have trouble spotting me. So, hi, I'm Brendan Falkowski. You can find me on Twitter @Falkowski. I run a design and front-end consultancy business called Gravity Department. It's a solo operation, and I just celebrated my 5th anniversary. And I've been thinking and speaking and working on responsive design in e-commerce for the last 3 years. My work is split between client consulting and product development. These companies have hired me to steer their front-end strategy. And it's my job to understand their product and their customer, set priorities, and execute both the design and the technical implementation of responsive design. My clients have been recognized in Internet Retailer's Hot 100 and Mobile 10 lists. I was nominated for a Brilliant Newcomer Award by Net Magazine last year, and my work's been featured across the web. On the other side, I build products like Acumen, which is a Magento community theme that I've maintained for over 4 years, and Mage Frontend, which is a responsive design system for retailers that are implementing and maintaining extremely customized front ends in Magento Enterprise. Both these products are driven by my consulting work, and they both have launch news coming just around the corner. I'm also a member of Magento's advisory certification board, and I'm a certified front-end developer, and a contributor to Magento 2, working with the community to ensure that the most future-friendly technologies are being implemented in the front end. So I stay pretty busy most of the time. And this is not my first talk about responsive design and e-commerce. It's actually my 4th here at Imagine in the last 3 years, and they flow as a series. So if you haven't seen them, there's not really any repeat or recap. You've got some homework to do. And I keep getting invited back because multi-device commerce keeps changing, and its importance keeps increasing. Let's look at the state of multi-device e-commerce in 2014. Screens are everywhere now. In 2012, half a square foot of LCD was sold for every human being on Earth. That's about 125 square miles, and it's roughly the size of Edinburgh, Scotland. Device diversity and growth is exploding year after year. The number of unique Android devices nearly tripled in the last year. By 2020, the number of smartphone users in the US will be equal to the US population over the age of 13. Nearly 40% of the traffic on Thanksgiving and Black Friday this year was from mobile devices. And year over year, that was a 46% increase. I've talked in the past why e-commerce sites have been slow to implement responsive design. It's really hard to do well. Every year, my friend Tom Robertshaw at MeanBee publishes a study on e-commerce trends in the Alexa top 1,000,000 sites. 16% of e-commerce sites are now using responsive design, which is up from just 1% a year ago. That's a remarkable leap forward, considering that 4 years ago, this technology didn't even exist. Many companies have abandoned big investments in mobile sites and apps in favor of responsive design. And it seems mute to say that all these differently sized screens are not going anywhere. You need a strategy to meet the needs of people who regularly and easily switch between them when it suits them, because that's the reality. And when Magento requested speaking proposals for this year, I hesitated, because I've already said a lot about this topic. In fact, 499 slides and about an hour and 45 minutes of me blabbing. But today, nobody debates that responsive design is an excellent strategy. It has universal technology, it's a great investment, and customers love it. And I'm sorry to say that the boat on that innovation has set sail. Fluid multi-device experiences are the baseline today. You're not special for having it. That's the expectation from customers. But the mistake I see companies making left and right is that they're treating responsive design like a to-do. Great experiences are not a feature that you check off and move on from. You have to go deeper. So I found my topic. Beyond the fundamentals of responsive, what should you do? What should you measure? What do you value? Now, when I say front end, I literally mean everything facing your users. Things like content, branding, copywriting, interaction, user flows, information architecture, code, emotion, and performance. When I do long-term consulting with companies, I'm responsible for tying all of those decisions into one cohesive experience. That's front-end strategy to me. The output of it is a design system, and it's really complex. I love building them because it's super hard to do well, and they're even more challenging to nurture and grow. The alternative is death by 1,000 tweets. People will tell everyone they know if your website lets them down from a technical glitch or just a miscommunication. How are design systems formed? John Gall is a systems theorist who in 1975 wrote that a complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that works. A complex system designed from scratch never works, and it cannot be patched up to make it work. You have to start over with a working, simple system. Mobile devices are a catalyst right now, and they're forcing us to dismantle systems, things that we've built over the last decade, and rethink them with a fresh start. In the modern meaning, the word evolution inherits from the British usage during the mid-1800s. Evolution is a process that adds complexity through natural selection. This is to say that nature has its mediocre designs eaten by its good designs. You should all know who Bill Nye is. The theory of natural selection is credited to Charles Darwin, a naturalist working before genetics were widely understood. And today he's typically associated with this ape-to-man graph, although he deliberately skirted linking our origin to apes. Darwin rejected the idea of transmutation, which was popular at the time, and suggested that species adapted to their environment with cellular changes, and then they passed those traits on to the next generation. Evolution as we know it today, and what Darwin hypothesized, is that genetic mutations are present in the population to begin with, and it's the environment that changes. That's what causes the trait to become valuable. And then subsets of the population which exhibit that trait successfully reproduce or die off. In 2010, 6 billion photos were uploaded to Facebook every 2 months. And then the same year, Instagram, which was a mobile-only app, launched and excelled in a space that Facebook failed to adapt to. Survival of the fittest does not mean the biggest muscles or the most intelligent. It means those that fit in the best with their environment. It cost Facebook $1 billion to acquire Instagram and mitigate the risk of losing user data because they didn't fit in with the environment and they couldn't adapt. At scale, we find that it's extrinsic changes in the environment that drive evolution. It's not factors like competition or adaptation. The mobile revolution is now unwinding into a diverse spectrum of interchangeable devices. You need to constantly consider if your systems, values, and goals are fitted to that new environment, because there's almost certainly a startup that's naturally suited to those changes. Future-friendly priorities are what I've been thinking about. And there are 2 areas that I'm directing my attention for companies that have already adopted responsive design and they're ready to iterate. Focus on maintainability and always respect performance. Let's get started. Maintainability. When talking about responsive design's long-term value, I think the root question is, how many jobs are you hiring a responsive site to do? And today people answer a phone site and a tablet site and a desktop site. So you're hiring responsive design to be 3 different implementations, but also fill the gaps between them. And to build responsively, it takes the resources of less than 3, but more than 1 site. The sweet spot is around 2. And the lower range turns out kind of terrible. I call this responsive design technically because many responsive sites don't meet the potential of the approach. They're doing the bare minimum to function on different devices, and that shows. The upper range has the legroom that's really necessary to create an excellent experience. And usually the companies that are investing this way don't stop after a major relaunch. They're constantly reinvesting in their front end because it's already paying dividends for them. The difference between them is a word that gets thrown around a lot by designers: craftsmanship. And for some, craftsmanship means poring over details that only other designers notice and appreciate. And to me, craftsmanship has a different meaning: durability. If you spend time building and nurturing a design system that reflects your brand's values, it enables you to prototype and validate new ideas more easily because you're not hung up on modernizing or reviewing how you communicate with customers. That saves you time and money. You can chase trends like skeuomorphism or flat design, but designing for durability means that you're investing in your brand and the relationship your customers have with you over a long period of time. That starts to feel respectable and familiar rather than dated. Design systems contain patterns, standards, and principles that ensure the quality, consistency, and resilience of your site in the future. When clients and their in-house teams take the reins, they need something to point to and say, this is how we work and why. The reason people rally around frameworks and conventions is because it saves time along the way, but they rarely go back to document the decisions that they made. Design systems shouldn't be an artifact of what you did. They should be more like DNA. DNA is biological information storage. It's instructions to make more of you, but not a clone. It's a mashup with something else. This is how a design system should work. It's new information and new constraints, but a familiar process and decision-making. Teams that invest in establishing and cultivating a design system end up saving cycles when they're implementing it. On a recent project, 15% of the total budget was spent building a pattern library and establishing development standards. Because the front end and back end systems were being built asynchronously by 2 independent teams, initially we wasted a lot of time refactoring the overlapping parts. By documenting our principles as they grew with the project, the team started policing itself. And in the second half of the project, time spent on refactoring was 72% lower, despite containing the bulk of the development and QA work. For most industries, these practices are trade secrets, but some organizations are open to sharing them. Anna Debenham wrote a book on front-end style guides and pattern libraries and has started publicly bookmarking resources that other organizations have shared. I haven't yet had a client ready to share the design systems we've built publicly, so I've started extracting some of those principles, standards, and processes that Gravity Department follows into a public resource called Field Manuals. They're a work in progress, but people are already finding them useful and thinking about building similar resources for their own teams. Long-term, your design system and front-end code base is going to keep growing. And it's your job to make sure that it stays maintainable, which is basically 2 concerns: complexity and size. Complexity management should begin by defining a consistent architecture for front-end modules and patterns. There are several high-quality methodologies for this, and my own process borrows aspects of each. I can't dive into each one of them individually, but the links here provide resources for you to explore them further and decide what makes sense for your team and your goals. On size management, Harry Roberts gave a brilliant talk at the last CSSConf EU about normalizing design systems. His main point was that a smaller system is a better system. There's less to look after, there's less to go wrong, and that requires saying no to a lot of valid requests. We have so much capability today that everything can be built, and someone has to question whether it should be built. Does it serve the user better than an existing pattern? What's the value of maintaining a variation to the business? In my talk last year, I suggested the idea of a front-end steward, someone that's responsible for balancing the technical and business needs of a website's front end. And I've never worked with an organization that fills this role officially. It's always adopted by a member of the team or a community member. But it's vital that organizations leave space for this kind of dialogue. The least maintainable system is any system after a year without a guardian. That might have to be you. Front-end performance is a design constraint and a major consideration when building a responsive site. Above every other concern, if your site is slower than users are willing to tolerate, you've already failed. Now, I need your help for this. Raise your hand if you expect websites to load in less than 1 second. Okay, keep the hands up. How about 2 seconds? Okay, 3 seconds. Everyone, hands up, keep them up. Okay, it looks like that's just about everybody in the room. You put the hands down. You're a tough crowd because websites aren't that fast. They just aren't. 3 seconds is above average. 2 seconds is extraordinary. And 1 second is just phenomenal. Let me give you some perspective on this. Who has the best infrastructure and engineering talent in the world? Most people would probably say Google. And Google suggests that 200 milliseconds is an optimal time to first byte, which is the server response. Let's look at how Google does themselves. Ouch. That's about 2.7 times slower than their recommendation. What about page load time? Google barely manages 2 seconds, barely, and their page is nearly empty. I don't know if you're ready to see how e-commerce sites are doing. We're failing pretty miserably. Since last year, the Alexa top 500 retail sites has slowed by 21%. And the median page load time is now 9.3 seconds. That's 31% heavier than last year. Now a page is 1.44 megabytes. And in fact, from the top 100 retail sites, people you would expect to be phenomenal, only 20% of them were interactive within 3 seconds. And 26% of them took more than 8 seconds to be interactive. Those are not projections. Those are facts. That's the history that we've written. If we go back a little bit further, we look at the Alexa top 1,000. Over the last 3 years, they've become 151% heavier. The vast majority of performance problems are because of us. They're not because of the technology. We're stuffing too much shit into every page, and we're not being smart about how we're doing that. To understand how we can improve, we need to look at how bandwidth and latency affect web page performance. Ilya Grigorik is a web performance engineer at Google, and he literally wrote the book on high-performance networking. The laws of physics put some pretty hard limits on the performance we can get out of telecommunications, but he makes it clear that bandwidth is not the barrier. Broadband speed and availability have steadily risen over the last few years. But we know that faster connections have diminishing returns at a surprisingly low point. From 1 to 2 megabits per second, the page loads almost twice as fast. But between 5 and 10 megabits, it's only 5% faster. For anything quicker than a 3G connection, the effect on page load times is negligible. More bandwidth only helps if you're streaming high volumes of data like video. The important metric is latency, which measures the round-trip time for each request to reach the server and respond back. Latency has a direct correlation to performance. For every 20 milliseconds in latency, there's a linear improvement in page load times. And unfortunately, this is completely out of your control. Sending a packet from New York to San Francisco has a minimum round-trip time of 40 milliseconds. Physics. And I'm sorry to say that we can't go faster than the speed of light. In real life, a transcontinental request is more like 50 to 100 milliseconds because the last mile between you, the user, and your ISP is a pretty big bottleneck compared to the internet backbone. And on mobile devices, the situation is far less stable. It's not unusual to measure latency between 100 and 1,000 milliseconds, and if the device has been idle, then you have to add another 1,000 to 2,000 milliseconds while a radio link is established. All this network negotiation needs to happen before the server returns a single byte. So the number one thing you can do to improve mobile performance, or any performance, is minimize the number of requests you have to make so the page can load with the fewest interruptions. What exactly is page load time, though? Depending on the measurement, that's a very different picture of site speed. Every request has to follow this sequence. There's a DNS lookup, you make a TCP connection, there may be SSL negotiation if the connection needs to be secured, then you make a request, you wait for the response, and this is where you get that first byte back, and then you can actually execute what you've downloaded. Time to first byte is kind of the key measure here, and all of the backend optimizations that your hosting partners do are designed to make this number as small as possible. But remember, that's only 10 to 20% of the total page load time. The rest of it is spent on the front end. So as the browser is streaming the response, it's decoding it at the same time, and it's firing off events in the HTML5 navigation timing API. And I'm only going to highlight the important ones here. As you can see, there are quite a lot of events. DOM interactive fires after the browser has finished parsing that document. As it's going, it starts seeing things in the code. It sees CSS and scripts and images, and it starts requesting them immediately. And every time it does that, it fires off a new request flow. Now, it may be blocked until they're downloaded and parsed. So you have to be really careful about where and how many of those assets are included. Now, even though individual assets may be very, very small, you still have to go through that whole expensive network negotiation phase up front, especially if it's a different server than your origin. The other event is DOM complete, which is what we normally associate with page load time. This fires when everything is done. So all the assets are loaded, but content triggered from scripts may still be executing in the background. This is equivalent to the window.onload event. And Google Analytics uses page load time as its primary site speed metric. So when you look at that, you may think your site is quite a bit slower than it feels like to you. But it doesn't really make the performance picture any clearer. In this case, we know that it took 1.31 seconds for all the network negotiation to reach the DOM interactive event, but DOM complete didn't fire until 4.95 seconds. So what's happening for the 3.5 seconds or so in between? The answer is your browser's parsing, waiting, and rendering. Those other assets that we requested can significantly delay the content from appearing. CSS blocks the critical rendering path, meaning the browser can't start showing the DOM content visibly until all the CSS rules are downloaded and parsed. This helps the browser reflow and paint the DOM efficiently, But for users, it means that a blank screen is all they get while CSS is loading. So you want to do everything you can to make this asset small, make sure it loads before any other assets, and reduce latency to it. JavaScript is double trouble because it blocks the rendering path and it blocks further downloading. Browsers try to download multiple assets in parallel, but because JavaScript depends on execution order and it may alter the DOM, browsers will stop rendering and downloading other assets until a script has finished loading and executing. Ideally, JavaScript should be placed before the closing body tag instead of in the head. This takes JS off the critical rendering path and prevents it from delaying the display of content. Unfortunately, this is not possible in Magento because it has core JS dependencies in the body content. So you need to be extra diligent about other optimizations because this is just a punch you have to take. If any render blocking asset suffers high latency or it times out with no response, then the rendering path freezes and users see nothing. This is known as a single point of failure, and you normally think about them in terms of a back-end system. It means that one part of a system that stops working causes the whole system to fail. CSS, JavaScript, and web fonts are all failure points on the front end. You need to do everything in your power to minimize or defer their impact. This is especially true for any third-party asset that's hosted externally on infrastructure that you don't control. If there isn't an immediate failover or asynchronous execution, it could take your site down when they go down. This is as damaging as having your database server or load balancer crash. It means nobody can access the site. The best way to make performance a priority is by attaching business metrics to it. Last year, I spoke about how Walmart drew direct revenue correlations from every 100 milliseconds in latency. This chart shows the exit rate versus page load time for Wikia. The faster page loads on the left retained more users. Slower page loads on the right had more exits. Shouldn't really shock anyone, but a 5-second improvement created a 200% increase in retention. There's no debating that faster web pages engage users longer, convert better, and make more money. But what do we actually mean by faster? Because we still haven't defined a usable metric for rendering speed. When it comes to performance, Steve Souders usually has the answer. Window.onload is not the best metric for measuring site speed. It's really popular because it's easy to measure, it's reliable to reproduce, and you can test it a lot without adversely affecting traffic. 10 years ago, pages were mostly HTML and images, so page load time was a pretty good indication of when the content was ready. But today, we're sending truckloads of assets that affect when the content is visible. In most sites, you can start reading or interacting with a page before the site finishes loading. Time to interaction is the critical metric, not page load time. It matters when users perceive a page to be done more than when it's technically complete. The concept of above the fold, meaning content you can see without scrolling, finally has some use. The fold is a helpful marker when it comes to rendering. This page from Amazon takes 5 seconds to load completely, but it looks almost the same as it does after the first 2 seconds. It doesn't really matter when the content outside of the viewport finishes rendering, as long as it's ready when the user sees it. Critical path optimization should be the focus on delivering and rendering content within the viewport first, because this primarily influences the user's perception of speed. It matters when the site looks done, not when it's actually done. But there isn't a timing API to measure perceived speed, because it's not really a concrete event. Depending on how the page is architected and how the content is sourced, sections of above-the-fold content may appear ready at different times. Speed Index was created to address this and provide a reliable metric for analyzing perceived speed. It measures the average time at which parts of the page are displayed. And it does that by calculating or by capturing screenshots every 100 milliseconds until the DOM complete event fires. Then each frame is visually compared to the final frame to determine a percentage of completeness. Time versus completeness is plotted on a graph, and the area above the curve is measured. A lower speed index score means better performance. Measuring above the curve rewards sites that visibly show the most content to the user the quickest without penalizing them for making smaller adjustments later. This is the closest to how users actually perceive the speed of a site without relying on a DOM timing event. You can measure speed index directly from webpagetest.org, which is a super powerful front-end performance analysis tool. And it's what I use to gather a lot of the data that you'll see in this talk. Here's the speed index distribution from Alexa's top 300,000 sites. The mean is about 4,500, and the median is around 3,500. And here are speed index scores from real e-commerce sites. I want to point out a few things on here. Google and Amazon are pretty close. Like you'd expect, they do well. A lot of other big names, though, are 2 to 4 times slower than them. Home Depot, Apple, eBay, Walmart. You wouldn't expect to see this kind of performance diversity, but this illustrates how difficult of a problem this is to solve. And I put 2 of my own clients on here, Skinny Ties and Angry Birds. They're the only responsive sites up there, and responsive design has a reputation for being slow. And they're also the only Magento sites up there, which also has a reputation for being slow. But as you can see, they're actually doing fairly well by comparison. If you make the right front-end performance optimizations, Magento and responsive design are fast, separately and together. A great example of companies focusing on the wrong thing is content delivery networks. CDNs are an excellent tool. Instead of serving all your content from one location, you replicate it across multiple locations and you serve it closest to the user. This makes it faster to download. Now, 75% of the top 100 retail sites use CDNs. But if your CDN is your entire front-end performance strategy, then you're doing it wrong. It turns out sites using CDNs are a full second slower on average. How can that be? CDNs are not the problem. They are faster. But sites using them tend to ignore other important performance optimizations on the front end. Aggressive, holistic optimizations that address all of the front-end complications have more impact than implementing a CDN, even though the content is not delivered optimally. By all means, if you can do both, go for it, but it's not a magic wand. Tim Kadlik wrote an article that asked, how fast is fast enough? A problem that's good to have. And one answer came from Paul Irish, who's a developer advocate for the Google Chrome team. He said a speed index of under 1,000. Now, even Google scores a 1308. It's extremely difficult to get a speed index score of under 1,000 for an uncached page load. And that last part is critical, an uncached page load. Raise your hand if your conversion funnel from acquisition to sale happens entirely on one page. I don't see any hands. If you only measure performance at the page level, then you're ignoring a fundamental difference in how users perceive your site. A typical conversion funnel includes 5 pages. You go to home, then a catalog list, then a product page, then cart, then checkout. Not only do you need to measure performance across the entire flow, but you have an opportunity to specifically optimize for that path. You can design how and when assets are prefetched, front-loaded, delayed, lazy-loaded at every step of that journey. Being smarter about the way assets are bundled and cached can dramatically improve a user's experience. In my work, front-end performance is a constant consideration from kickoff to launch. It's baked into every suggestion and decision that I make. My clients understand and care about front-end optimizations that I implement, so performance doesn't slip. This is Philip Petit walking between the World Trade Centers in 1974. And before you launch a site, front-end optimization is really similar to walking a high wire. Everything is very deliberately staged and controlled. You try to identify and isolate all the variables, and every step you take is calculated and balanced. And when that act is performed, it seems like an effortless stroll to the observer. But maintaining a performant front end is very different. It's more like walking a slack line. As you move forward, things are swaying, bouncing, and twisting beneath you. It takes a very different kind of discipline to harmonize out those wobbles without affecting the execution. You need governance from developers, marketers, content managers, and all the third parties who touch your site. Everyone has to be responsible for performance going forward because anyone in that process can tie on a sandbag. Real user monitoring tools are designed to track on-page performance from actual user sessions. They provide you with a sample of real-world data from varying locations, connection qualities, and devices, which shows more outliers than lab testing will often do. My favorites are SpeedCurve, New Relic, and Pingdom. And a lot of sites already have some of these tools implemented, but you may not be using the RUM tools inside them, so check that out. They're really helpful because they alert you when something slips compared to historical performance. And it may not be something that you would perceive just by browsing the site. But they can't fix the problem for you or always identify the underlying cause. And most companies can't fix their front end internally, even if they have the technical capability. Who controls what can be politically charged, and nobody wants to have their contribution or area of the site axed. The best way to mediate is completing an objective audit. This is a limited consulting service that Gravity Department does that's focused specifically on improving front-end performance. It's a hands-on analysis of every aspect of your front end that flags and explains what you're doing well or poorly or you're not doing at all. And it includes concrete steps to make your progress on performance goals known. If that's something that you're struggling with, get in touch. Responsive design has proven again and again to be the most efficient, universal, and maintainable foundation of a front-end strategy. I'm thrilled to have helped Magento and eBay Enterprise to make it part of their core product. Now, when you're planning for phase 2, remember these 2 priorities. Engaging my clients to adopt and carry those flags has made them believers that front-end strategy is a critical investment and a massive opportunity for them. Thank you for listening, and thank you for Magento and eBay for inviting me back several times. And I'll see you next year. Let's have some fun tonight.